CASI's Fall Seminar Series. My name is Nafees Hassan. I'm a postdoctoral research scholar at CASI, and along with my colleagues, moderate this series. The seminar series, which we do both in the fall and the spring, comprises talks by a diverse range of scholars from India and the US on a variety of critical and contemporary topics. Our speakers come from a wide range of disciplines, including political science, anthropology, sociology, economics, and public policy. We have these talks typically on Thursdays at noon Eastern Time. So please sign up for them on the CASI website. So before I introduce today's speaker, just to put in a plug for next Wednesday, not Thursday this time, that is November 17th, we have a virtual book talk by Professors Sanjay Chakravarti and Nilanjan Sirkar, who are the editors of a very exciting volume called Colossus, the Anatomy of Delhi. This volume is special to us as it emerged out of the CASI 25th anniversary workshop on urbanization in November 2017. Please register for this event on the CASI's website. So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Malini Sur to the seminar today. Dr. Sur is a senior lecturer in anthropology at Western Sydney University. She studies agrarian borderlands, cities, and the environment. She is the author of Jungle Passports, Fences, Mobility, and Citizenship at the Northeast India-Bangladesh Border, University of Pennsylvania Press 2021, which this seminar is centered around. She has also published on borderlands in cultural anthropology, comparative studies in society and history, and modern Asian studies. Dr. Sur has co-edited 2 special issues in City and Economic and Political Weekly on construction and repair economies. Dr. Sur's photographs on South Asia's borders have been exhibited in Amsterdam, Berlin, Bonn, Chiang Mai, Göttingen, Heidelberg, Kathmandu, and Munich. Her first documentary film, Life Cycle, about air pollution and urban cycling in India, has been screened in Baltimore, Canberra, Kolkata, Perth, Santiago, Singapore, and Sydney. In other words, she's not only a prolific writer, but also a creative artist. Let me now say a few words about the book. Jungle Passports recasts established notions of citizenship and mobility along violent borders. The author shows how the division of sovereignties and distinct regimes of mobility and citizenship push undocumented people to undertake perilous journeys across previously unrecognized borders every day. Paying close attention to the forces that shape the life worlds of deportees, refugees, farmers, smugglers, migrants, bureaucrats, lawyers, clergy, and border troops, she reveals how reciprocity and kinship and the enforcement of state violence, illegality, and border infrastructures shape the margins of life and death. Combining years of ethnographic and archival fieldwork, her thoughtful and evocative book is a poignant testament to the force of life in an era of closed borders, insularity, and illegal migration. So before I turn it to our speaker, just to remind you, we are going to have a similar format like last time. So if you have questions at the end, could you please use the chat box to send them directly to me, Nafees Hassan, and I will call on you to pose your question to our presenter. Please keep your question brief and to the point so we can get to as many as possible, and apologies in advance if we can't get to everyone. Also, please use the chat box only for questions. Finally, please be mindful about muting your mics throughout the duration of the event, and also please remember that you cannot record this presentation without prior permission from the presenter. Once again, thank you for your interest and for being here today. With that, I'm going to turn to Dr. Sur to take us away.
Thank you, Nafees, for your introduction, and a very heartfelt thank you to Tarek and Naveen. I'm very honored to be with all of you this morning. It's early morning in Sydney. Today I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Darug Nation, where I live and work. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emergent. These lands have never been ceded, and they never will. Now, what I'll do in the next half an hour or so that I have with you is to present you Jungle Passports in 3 parts. And I'll begin with part 1, which is about roads and rail. A broken asphalt and mud road connected Romari, Bangladesh, with Tura, a town in the state of Meghalaya, Northeast India. For over 6 decades, Ali's ox cart had traveled the almost 50-mile distance between Bangladesh's marshlands and Northeast India's hills. In British times and even later, the 80-year-old cartman told me Except for the bustling frontier markets that the road led to, our journeys were silent. From Tura and onwards to Bhutan and Tibet, we did not see anyone for miles. Traders flocked to Ali's doorstep carrying fuel and cooking utensils for the long journey, returning from Tura with precious timber. A mile away from Ali's house, Romari's retired postmaster pointed out the sturdy wooden beams supporting the post office roof, telling me that the wood to make them had also traveled downhill from Tura. Stories about the Romari-Tura road unevenly connected Ali's ox-cart journeys along the river Brahmaputra with the Garo, and I quote, turtle hunters, unquote. Mahfouz, an elderly imam, guided me as we walked along the Romari-Tura road, starting at the erstwhile Romari Ghat, the key. Raising his voice so that I could hear him over the sound of speeding buses, he described how during the British era, steamer boats had sailed from this dockyard, which was then in the British province of Bengal, to the neighboring province of Assam. Stopping to catch his breath at the side of the road, he silently indicated a pillar. Hidden in a patch of grass, time had reduced the cemented pillar to a stone stub. It stood by a shallow lake. Slowly circling a shaky finger, Mahfouz drew invisible lines in the air, sketching the sturdy ropes that had once chained the boats to the pillars. The loud honking of buses interrupted the momentary silence that had descended. It jolted us to the present, diverting our attention away from the pillar to the busy road. We continued walking eastward in Tura's direction. Soon we reached the Bangladesh-India border. Sandbags shielded a Bangladeshi border outpost from potential fire from the Indian side. Bangladesh's border troops stood at the outpost gate with guns strapped to their chests. Mahfouz and I walked again, stopping at a distance from the angular metal pillars of India's new barrier. Mahfouz pointed in the direction of Tura, describing it as the land of the Garus. Earlier, I had conducted fieldwork in Tura, a dusty town that India's federal security forces had heavily militarized. Except for the undocumented Bangladeshi laborers from Romari and its adjoining shores who worked in Tura, no one had ever mentioned the road. The Romari-Tura road's presence in Bangladesh, where border villagers mythologize it, and its absence in northeast India, queries the relationship between the marshes and the adjoining hills. The British colonial archives had consigned the roads to obscurity. The disjuncture between the contemporary ubiquity of an old trade route in Romari, its relative lack of acknowledgement in Tura, and its historical incomprehensibility in the British records probes why the remnants of roads gather impetus as an ethnographic force. Who constructed this road and why? Where did the road begin? Where did it end? Who were the inhabitants of Romari and Tura? Now, in seeking to answer these seemingly very simple questions, we have to reckon how in 19th century British India road building was intrinsically tied to the making of tribes and the marking of borders that came to comprise regions of British India's northeastern frontiers. Jungle passages and roads were fundamental to British territorial incursions that came to bear upon frontier settlements and identities. What is today romantically recalled as a trade connector in Romari was in effect a disorderly passage for appropriating land and conscripting labor in Tura and its surrounding regions. In fact, the Romari-Tura road functioned as a disruptive segregator, both in its territorial forms as well as in its human implications. In other words, roads were border fences and walls long before India's new border fence with Bangladesh made a gradual appearance in this landscape. As geographical, instrumental, and political designs, routes enabled access to unexplored terrains that British East India Company and later the British state came to control as frontier territories. South Asia's frontier historians have demonstrated how routes were arteries of commerce and warfare. Roads specially possessed strategic importance since they provided access and passage for military interventions. Road connections aligned borders and communities. Their material formations made the borders of maps real. Here I quote Shade Hines and Mahnaz Isfahani. In regions that came to comprise British India's northeastern frontiers, roads were sites of territorial contestations between colonial officials who desired access to territories and indigenous societies who rebelled against aggressive demands for passage. As segregating devices, roads created settled frontiers, such as Romari, and savage frontiers, such as Sura. Representational and developmental processes that rested on punitive expeditions, civilizing missions, and resource extraction in the hills of northeastern borderlands of the British Empire came to forge the identity of the Garos as primitive in comparison to other ethnic inhabitants of the British provinces of Bengal and Assam. The savage recurs as a trope to describe all types of resistance in this region. In the rich historical accounts of territorial alliances and resistances, including the Khasis and the Nagas, tribes emerge as prototypes of cultural specificity and social structure. In Jungle Passports, I unsettle this recurring historical motive. I also show how these frontiers continue to anchor political tensions to nervously hold together uneven territories while pulling people apart in competing political directions. Part 2, Foreigners Tribunals X1 and 2 in Assam. As soon as the bus from Dispur, Assam's capital city, entered a border town that I call Melkiganj, a loosely suspended sign greeted visitors. The border signpost expressed gratitude to travelers for visiting India, announcing the end of Indian territory even before visitors could enter the town's bureaucratic enclave. The enclave was a short distance from the bus depot. Inside the enclaves were foreigners' tribunals X1 and X2, two of the 100 tribunals adjudicating the borders of Indian citizenship and Bangladeshi migrant illegality in Assam. As I started observing and noting the judicial proceedings in this two-storied house that accommodated the two tribunals, the borders between Indian citizens and unauthorized Bangladeshis constantly blurred. The frail Nehar Bibi, 65 or so, was completely oblivious that the police had identified her as a suspected Bangladeshi and had summoned her to the tribunal. When her name was announced, Bibi entered the courtroom, wiping her face with a green handkerchief. Exhausted from fasting for the holy month of Ramadan, she slowly grabbed the arm of a plastic chair by the door with her bony hands. She made an attempt to sit. At once, her lawyer stopped her. The court typist glared at her from under his glasses. In the absence of the state prosecutor, who was late, the judge asked Bibi to present her case. She mumbled. The judge tried to facilitate the process and asked her a few questions. She failed to answer. Confused, she made eye contact with her witness, a neighbor named Bari, who presented himself before the court. It was only during Bari's testimony to the court that the state prosecutor barged into the trial room, profusely apologizing to the judge for his delay. Holding his hands theatrically at Bibi, he bowed in an obvious display of respect. He requested that as an elder, she forgive him for the questions that he was obliged to ask. With this apology, he hurled a torrent of questions at Bari, Bibi's witness, to compensate for his late arrival. Giving Bari only a few seconds to think, the prosecutor constantly confused him and demanded that he present his birth and marriage certificates before the court. Dumbfounded, Bari looked helplessly at the lawyer and claimed that he was not asked to procure his own documents before coming to the court. Seizing upon the moment of confusion, the state prosecutor announced to the court that Bibi and Bari had worked on a series of carefully crafted lies to acquire Indian citizenship. Looking at the judge, he announced in a booming voice, Bari is a Bangladeshi national, and he is falsely supporting the claims of another Bangladeshi national, Nehar Bibi. Bibi lacked identity documents except for a voter identity card that was inadmissible as evidence of Indian citizenship, as these were often falsely procured. Furthermore, she did not have a registered marriage certificate. The legal question was whether Nehar Bibi had enough evidence to prove that she was her father's daughter. Although her father's name, Asuf Ali, appeared in the 1965 electoral rolls, there were no documents to prove that Bibi was his daughter. The prosecutor interpreted her uncertain and jumbled responses, as well as the lack of documentary evidence, as sufficient reason to believe that she was an illegal Bangladeshi. Gloating with self-importance At having proved the suspect to be an illegal Bangladeshi, the prosecutor pointed at her to loudly announce, "You, Nehar Bibi, have come to India after March 25th, 1971. You have entered here illegally and you're a Bangladeshi." Since she could not sign, the typist quickly asked Bibi to put her thumb impression on a court document that stated her case had been examined. With a smug smile, the prosecutor patted the visibly flustered defense counsel on his back. So, who or what drove people like Nehar Bibi into the foreigners' tribunals? Let me give you just a very quick glimpse into the activities of Assam's specially constituted border police, who conduct surveys and identify suspects. One among the many constables was Investigator 012, whom I've named after the esoteric manner in which he classified his police reports. His case diaries illustrate the varied ways in which detection serves to entrench suspicions along borders. Over 6 months, 012 reported arriving in the village Kachari at precisely 9:15 every morning. At 10, he left for his pre-selected destination, the house of the suspected Bangladeshi, arriving at exactly 1 in the afternoon. For an hour, he employed various interrogation techniques and gathered intelligence about the suspects from their neighbors. By 3 in the afternoon, the expedition was complete. He folded his survey sheets and left for the local police station. At 6 in the evening, 012 ended his day. For the 6 months that he investigated suspected foreigners in the village of Kachari, 012 reported traveling 3 times to the same house and meeting several suspects belonging to the same family. Instead of firmly locating people in specific places, 012's meticulously handwritten notes reinforces registers of imprecision. The judge took note of Nehar Bibi's statements about her father's compulsions to constantly migrate as a landless laborer to seek work and her relocation to her husband's house upon an early marriage. He emphasized that Bibi disagreed with the state prosecutor's claims and stated that the police had not conducted adequate inquiries. He recorded that Nehar Bibi had submitted her father and husband's electoral documents in original and certified copies from village authorities. The judgment stated that although the state prosecutor doubted whether Bibi was the daughter of Asub Ali and the wife of Sohan Ali, he was unable to provide any evidence to the contrary. Furthermore, Bibi had provided evidence of her name in an older electoral register along with that of her husband's, endorsed by village authorities. The judge therefore delivered the verdict that Nehar Bibi was not a foreigner, she was an Indian citizen. Others, however, were not so lucky. The systems of disclosure upon which police surveillance relied had the effect of turning families against each other. Among those who sat pensively in the back office of the trial chamber was Monmohan Das. He claimed that in his village, which was a village in Assam that bordered Bangladesh, the police had encouraged people to come forward and disclose the name of unauthorized Bangladeshis. Monmohan insisted that his brothers were taking advantage of the new laws to dispossess him of his share of their father's property. He emphasized that his younger brother had notified the police that he was an illegal Bangladeshi to ensure that he was so embroiled in appearing before the tribunal that he would not have the time to fight another court case to make a claim on his father's land. Since doubts surrounded the identities of people such as Monmohan Das, who were accused of assimilating into refugee colonies as new migrants from Bangladesh, no one at the tribunals paid any heed to his claims about family conflicts. Intermittently, the din died down. When the identified suspects who the tribunal had summoned failed to appear, silence replaced the frenzied rustling of petitions and files, as well as the clamor of voices. Despite the police surveys and court summons, Assam's missing populations were neither legally nor physically identifiable. As subjects who eluded police mapping and legal verification, their absence added to the ever-evolving dynamics of citizenship and suspicion along the India-Bangladesh border. The clerks, Shujala Das, compressed these files under the category of untraceable or UP. Despite their inability to deport those deemed to be illegal Bangladeshis, The reports that police constable continually heaped on Shrikala Das's table testified to how electoral politics in Assam was driven by illegal Bangladeshis, quote unquote, and spread the state's tentacles in everyday life. Secret sources continued to leap out from the pages of police interrogation reports, their anonymity making them as powerful as the uniformed police constables they supported. And yet, the cases of missing suspects, as a mass of floating unidentified and undeportable populations, added to the dominant political imagination that illegal Bangladeshis in Assam were elusive criminal subjects. Sometimes, suspects who lacked identity papers, such as Bibi, transformed into Indian citizens. At other times, even when petitioners produced identity papers and certifications to prove their Indian citizenship claims, they were kept in limbo. So what are the rights of citizens and suspects who've been made stateless in Assam? How do marital and property rights, including the value addition of labor, fit into citizenship rights? Now, in Jungle Passports, I show how people with documentary evidence of Indian citizenship have been rendered stateless on the grounds that their paper identities are fraudulent, sometimes just on the basis that it is so easy to procure fake documents. Others who assert they are Indian citizens do not have the necessary papers to prove their claims to land as property, their marital relationships, and by extension, their claims to the membership of the Indian nation itself. Instead of resolving issues on unauthorized migration and land loss, the ethereal presence of Bangladeshi suspects in law and life accentuates Assam's dual predicament as a perennially repositioned internal and external frontier of Indian democracy. Even judgments at the tribunal do not necessarily obliterate confusion and social suspicion. The imposition of judicial borders through police surveys, court trials, and detentions, and now digital surveillance of night cameras and drones generates a panoptic of fear. Suspicions shape the politics of membership and belonging, rather than precisely determining the legal thresholds of either Indian citizenship or Bangladeshi migrant illegality. Laws encourage vigilance. Suspicion weaves in and out of intimate spaces and turns family, friends, and neighbors against each other. The policing and judicial systems of modern states presuppose suspicion in ways that foreground uncertainties and ambiguities. Suspicion becomes a device to decipher the boundaries of citizenship by harassing people, extorting money, manipulating papers, and settling scores. In Assam, the label Bangladeshi maligns, ridicules, and dispossesses people in the name of Indian citizenship. Part 3, the final part. So two things have happened here, as you would have probably guessed. One is that I went to Bangladesh to understand how border villagers in Bangladesh that had joined Assam and Meghalaya in Northeast India were being displaced or were responding to the fence, and a series of transnational flows that I followed. And there, instead of talking about the fence, villagers led me to a road which I couldn't find in the archives, and I kept looking for it. And now there are two reasons. There's one very obvious reason that I couldn't locate it in the archive. It's because I'm not trained as a historian, and probably I was not looking in the right file or the right box. But most importantly, it led me to a very different understanding of the region and its history. And it also forced me to rethink this infrastructure, this multi-layered fence that I was following from 2007 to 2015 that India was constructing along its borders with Bangladesh. It enabled me to resituate the structure in a 200-year history of land conflicts, land loss, and struggles over identity. And the second thing, as you know, I spoke to you about participant observation in 2 foreigners' tribunals in Assam, where I had permission to sit and to consult the archives and to witness the proceedings. And of course, I went there to study Indian citizenship, but as it happened, I returned with notes on suspicion. So let me come to the final part of my talk. So from 2007 till 2015, I closely followed the constructions of India's new fence that cut through Northeast India-Bangladesh border and studied its implications for border societies. The emergent infrastructures, routine floods, distraught animals reminded the villagers that they could not take for granted the land, the border, their relationships with one another and with border troops, or even the actions of animals for granted. On days when crossing the border was impossible, traders, transporters, and their families went hungry. Despite these difficulties, the division of sovereignties and distinct regimes of mobility pushed people to undertake perilous journeys in order to make a living. In remote border villages, children shouted, "Line clear, signal clear," as they ran around flying kites, reminding me again and again that borders are not just sites for studying the imprints of state violence. The rush journeys, Gurmuri Jatras in Bengali, and travel by jungle passports maintain trans-border livelihoods, kinship, and religious life amid nationalism, disasters, fear, and despair. At borders, people forged meaningful relationships beyond lines of nation, religion, and ethnicity. So, what is it that propels life to continue to revolve around a heavily fortified fence amid violence, scarcity, fear, and uncertainty? How have long-standing socio-ecological histories and territorial conflicts severed emergent political topographies of mobility and citizenship? How can attention to the forces that shape the life worlds of deportees, refugees, farmers, smugglers, migrants, bureaucrats, lawyer, clergy, and border troops in this region tell us about reciprocity and exchange and the enforcement of state violence, illegality, and border infrastructures in general? And what might these rural lives and their relationships to fences, longing, nostalgia, and deference convey about the unfinished business of nation building, identity, and insularity, or about the hardening of borders that is globally evident in the 21st century? So, in Jungle Passports, I have tried to answer these questions, and I show how borders continue to gather life's promises, even when walls and checkpoints brutally divide nations and societies. Despite the attendant risk, borders propel life worlds of mobility, identity, and citizenship that are perennially in the making. The powerful forces that regulate the fragile balance of life and death at the nation's margin compel people to cross borders again and again. Today, more than ever before, attention to these shifts may help scholars think about the life forces that connect divided landscapes. Over the last decade, the world has been experiencing a resurgent politics of nationalist authoritarianism that locates borders at the front lines of debates on globalization, unauthorized migration, and citizenship. While interlocked webs of relationships shape border societies, borders are also sites where a sense of being uprooted and rendered less than human continually lingers. By virtue of their location, the loyalty of border residents to the nation continues to be in doubt, and ethnic and religious minorities and the rural poor who reside here are rendered even more marginal to the projects of the nation state. The very dynamism, the tugs and pulls that hold people together across national territories and beyond the lines of blood simultaneously results in an enduring sense of danger and loss. So in Jungle Passports, I situate four elements: ecologies, infrastructures, exchanges, and mobility of this de facto system, showing how they work in tandem through permeable boundaries to shape the force of life and law at the Northeast India-Bangladesh border. Even in the sheer force of state violence, deadly ecologies, and incursive infrastructures, borders remain permeable. Such porosity, I argue, is hardly generative of failed projects of nationalism and border militarization. Instead, it attests to how border societies constantly recalibrate the nation's power of territorial regulation in their lives. Eric Beverly argues that frontiers not only signify edges that function as spatial limitations, but also, function as sites of creativity, power, and resources. Fragmented sovereignties along frontiers enable people to move between territories and partake in different regimes of authority. Frontiers are productive sites for marginal people because social and legal governance have limited impacts here. Borders, work in a similar way, making the brutal performances of sovereign authority most visible while showing how the territorial regulation of sovereign power is far from complete at the nation's edges. Now, scholarly discussions on life in unstable locations and times are especially critical today. The present offers a decisive political moment in which efforts to fortress territorial boundaries and ultranationalism are pushing people towards uncertain crossings and violent encounters with increasingly hostile nation states. The hardening of borders in the 21st century shows how force and life become enmeshed, where their productive tensions can be read as will and erasure, and where they mutate the ephemeral and the precarious into the durable. Now, the dual logic of force as momentum and as statics unfolds through the border's life-giving and life-taking properties. At borders, the more insidious workings of violent nationalism and arbitrary state power reveal life's relationships with a range of forces, forces that destroy life and forces that enact the productive potential of life. Borders generate decisive moments that establish the margins of precarity and prosperity and forge the boundaries of life and death. Now, I've given you the two ends of Jungle Passport. Let me tell you a little bit of what is in the middle of the book. So the book, as I was telling you, begins its arc in Romari in Bangladesh. Excuse me. So the book begins its arc in Romari, Bangladesh, where people's recollections surrounding an old trade route that you've heard about, the Romari-Tura Road, animates historical discussions. Now today, Romari and Tura are situated in two nation states, Bangladesh and India, and yet they belong to a borderland. So the road is a metaphor for disruption, mobility, connection, identity, and longing, themes that I engaged with in Jungle Passports. And it also provided the foundations to transcend the most obvious religious dichotomy in this region, the dichotomy of the Hindus and Muslims, the two majority religions of India and Bangladesh, respectively, as well as conventional understandings of ethnicity and gender. Now, I started searching for this road in old maps. Instead, I found its traces in the heliotropes of British colonial surveyors as they battled forest fires, in a devastating earthquake, and in the making of the Garos as a tribe. I continued journeying on the road through time, locating its changing forms through rice harvests raided and lost. Unknowingly, I traveled on the road with cattle traders and transporters. I left the road temporarily to follow Garo women's Jungle Passport journeys and the judicial trials of suspected Bangladeshis while carefully attending to questions of identity, legitimacy, and mobility that inform their lives. Now, the road makes a turn in the book through India's new border fence, fears, and recollections of a war. I had a final look at the road through the lens of an Indian soldier's binocular. As I held the binocular to my eyes, Bangladesh seemed so near. This, even as Indian border villagers arrived at the border outpost seeking permission to see the new Maria, a majestic structure standing between rice fields and forests. Everyone pointed towards Bangladesh as a new foreign land. Now, in Jungle Passports, I have attempted to show how the vitality and the political salience of borders transfixes some people in fear and nostalgia, while simultaneously pushing others to move. Most importantly, I advocate for carefully attending to the forces that shape border lives and are, in turn, shaped by borders. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Sir. That was a really evocative and very deep description of all the long years of fieldwork that you've done, and also, the historical connections that you've made. It's a really fascinating book. I don't see any questions in the chat box at the moment, but I'm sure people are still processing what you've said, and I'm sure there will be a few questions coming up. I just wanted to start off by, just making a few comments about what my thoughts were as I was listening to you, and also as I got a chance to read your introduction to the book. I'm looking forward to read the entire book soon. So I really, really love the angle that you take on thinking about what has been called in other places the anthropology of life, which is to say that spaces of precarity are not necessarily only visible to us through the kinds of violence that is perpetrated there, but also questions about how do people survive in spite of all of that, right? What strategies do they develop, and how do these strategies change in response to the domination of power? So I really I find that a really fascinating and a sort of rare perspective in places of this kind. What I was trying to understand better was the framing of sovereignty. And I know from the introduction that you've complicated it already by saying that, in following Wendy Brown's idea of the way in which sovereignty is being weakening. But I just wanted to understand better, where do you place that sovereignty? Because I'm wondering if, the nation state on one hand and the lives of the multi-pronged lives of border societies on the other, is the framing that you're looking at, or should we think of sovereignty more in terms of, governmentality, which is that there are these dispersed forces. And I can, I've grown up in the Northeast, so I've been following some of what's happening. Things like, student associations, for instance, in Meghalaya, the Khasi Students Association, which takes up the question of of borders very seriously. So the kind of like dispersion of power and domination that this space in some ways generates would be interesting to think about. I can see that's one of my first things. I have more thoughts, but I think I can see some questions coming in. So yeah, so it's really up to you. Would you like to respond to that, or should I ask Sandeepan to ask his question?
Nafees, can I respond to it quickly, and maybe I can come back to it again via
Sure.
the other question. So you're absolutely right in flagging the question of sovereignty, and if you look across disciplines, it's always a very Agamben inspired kind of entry point to understand borders. Uh, 15 years earlier, it was Foucault, and here I'm also thinking about Shankaran Krishna's marvelous article titled Cartographic Anxiety, in which he actually lays out, the frontiers of sovereignty as experienced by a Foucauldian analytic, and so for me, I wanted to enter this landscape with renewed attention to questions of vitality, to questions of life. And I wanted to do it without losing sight of the extreme violence and the uncertainty that people continue to live with against, offense. So I want to briefly make two interventions. I kind of make an entry through Nietzsche rather than through scholars of sovereignty. Not a very popular philosopher for anthropologists, Nasiva, both you and I know, but what attracted me to his work was, again, his kind of attention that transcended beyond the atomism that was prevalent in physics at that point of time, and the ways in which he understood material forces, or material reality as centers of force, and as a constellation of force. And that provided me, the Deleuzian reading of Nietzsche then provided me to enter into a broader anthropological discussion on forms of life, force of life, and I do this via Jao Bell and Brigopati Singh, and I do it in a way that provokes attention on vitality without losing sight on death. And mind you, here death is not just about, a very kind of a unidirectional sovereign force. It's much more than that. It's far more than that. And as I started thinking along these lines, because I, you know, I did not just study one infrastructure or one barrier. But what I do in Jungle Passport, I relocate India's fence in a 200-year history, which enabled me to see roads as fences, rice harvests, rice raids as fences, cattle transactions, the movement of bovine animals as fences, garments, export rejected garments as fences, but each of these barriers were also productive sites of exchange and reciprocity. So that kind of completely complicates sovereignty as an analytic entry point for me.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for that response. It's really, really, really fascinating. So I'm going to ask Sandeepan if he can unmute himself and ask the question.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so my question was, and this is something, I'm also kind of grappling with my own work on internal borders within India, like basically Odisha and Surat. So, and going through your work, I was thinking if your work sort of critiques heterotopia, or if you see borders as heterotopia. I mean, you touched upon it while you're answering the previous question. So, yeah. Thank you.
You know, the expert on your question is actually my friend and colleague Jason Carnes, who's written a brilliant book on the India-Bangladesh border. I do, I do in certain senses, and I do so more in dialogue with Jason's work on climate security and the ways in which climate is staged along the India-Bangladesh border. And he has a fantastic article in Cultural Anthropology. But I really haven't done much with heterotopia in my own work. I've admired what Jason has done. But yes, Sandeepan, we've lived through almost 2 years of the pandemic, and I don't know what kind of work you're doing in India's internal borders, but I think it's become even more significant with the pandemic.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. So next is Indavar. Indavar, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nafis. Thank you, Professor Sur, for the talk and the amazing book. So my question is, could you describe like what repercussions or echoes these stories of jungle passports might have on nation building or nation consolidating projects in core zones such as Delhi or Dhaka? Like, do you see echoes of this there, and how they might be, how these stories are, taken up in a place like that? Thank you.
Thanks, Indivar. The short answer is they're not, but the more complex answer is that look, we have a border that is governed with a very complex mixture of different forms of surveillance, and along India's borders with Bangladesh, the forms of surveillance that are directed against Muslims and the forms of surveillance and control that are directed against non-Muslims are very distinct. Now, in parts of the Garo borderland, which are predominantly Christian and quote unquote tribal on the Indian side and ethnic minorities on Bangladesh side, there is far more scope for questions of relationality than of difference, including deep relationships that Garo Bangladeshi border traders, women border traders, have with Indian troops. Now, if you look at the series of markets that intersperse the Garo borderland, they date to far back to the Mughal period, and in a sense, contemporary borders have come later, to bifurcate these markets. I think what is very interesting is that Meghalaya has demanded more connections with Bangladesh compared to Assam. The discourses of trans-border ethnicities, kinships, and trade have been very different in these two states, also because of their demographic compositions. The other thing is that, experimental markets have been set up in Meghalaya along the borders of Meghalaya and Bangladesh. And I think they are a very border hearts, and they're a very positive step in bringing border communities closer to national governance and rule. But again, as I show in Jungle Passport, forms of trans-border mobility alliances and including the kind of relationships that women especially have with border troops occur in completely unanticipated ways. And, in Jungle Passports, I also show how people don't go back and forth across borders just to make claims to, the imagination is that people are migrating or crossing borders to make claims to land as political territory. But that is not so. People also cross borders for a wide variety of reasons, including making moral claims to trans-border resources on account of kinship and other kind of ethnic and religious ties.
Thank you so much. So can I ask Aisha Vemuri to ask a question?
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. That was fabulous. And thank you for your book as well. I guess my question is about how forms of governmentality developed in places like Assam or on the borders and frontier regions, how they kind of act as laboratories, I'd say, for governance and then are extended into other parts. Obviously, I'm thinking about the CAA and NRC as things that came up first in Assam and then are extended into other parts of India. So I was wondering if you've thought about that at all and if you have any thoughts about how this is operating right now.
So Aisha, thanks so much for your question. When I started fieldwork in Assam in 2007, it was a very different political landscape, right? I entered a landscape of political dissidence. I encountered a very heavily militarized state. It was almost as if as soon as I reached Guwahati airport, I had reached the border between India and Bangladesh. Because of Assam's long history of very complicated sets of relationships that it has had with New Delhi. And, unauthorized Bangladeshi migration has been absolutely central to that relationship. And you're absolutely right in reminding us that the National Register for Citizens, the CAA, have been, the NRC is a classic case of, what was introduced in Assam at a very significant point of time. But as all of us know, questions of democracy, there have been electoral shifts in Assam. You have the BJP in power in Assam, which aligns very closely. You've had new regulations on cattle slaughter and beef ban in Assam. So when we talk about the present, we're talking about a very different political moment. Now, let me very quickly return to the NRC. When the NRC was initially implemented in Assam, people, including Assamese public intellectuals, thought that it would resolve questions of land conflict, land alienation, and this crisis of identity and language that has been at the heart of so many things that have gone wrong in Assam. And people really looked at this as a way, as a governmental device that could resolve questions. But I don't think in the post-colonial history of Assam, I don't think New Delhi has ever given Assam's priorities in a way consideration to improve either questions of governance or governmentality. So the present actually unfolds in a very interesting way to see a far closer alignment between Assam and the and Delhi. You know, it's a completely different regime of governance that we are seeing now.
Thank you so much. Tariq, would you like to ask your question?
Malini, thanks so much for that fantastic, rich and beautifully delivered talk. And yeah, I'm still processing a lot of it. And about, you know, not an anthropologist apology. So my question is not as theoretically informed, but I think one of the things that I was interested in what you were talking about is, you know, you're kind of wrestling with interesting sets of binaries. You know, you have the binary of kind of suspicion, but also meaningful relationships. You have a hardening of the border, but also permeability. And I know that's very much at the heart of of what you're doing analytically. But I was particularly interested in how these things play out among the sets of actors who are responsible for an increasingly militarized border. So, you know, the lawyers, bureaucrats, I mean, the border troops you're talking about, all of these people are heavily enmeshed in the production of the border and the maintenance of it and the surveillance of it. But I was interested in what the tensions, maybe the unanticipated, you talk about some of the unanticipated relationships that happen between villagers and migrants with these kind of state actors. But I was interested internally between them. Were there sites of unanticipated tensions, or I mean, sometimes their own directives or incentives may not always align, even thinking about the judge's actions versus the kind of state prosecutors, but looking at, you know, the kind of ways in which border troops may be very differently positioned than lawyers and bureaucrats, how that is kind of playing out at a time of increased surveillance and hardening, but how these local actors also increase centralization in India politically. So how all those dynamics are maybe playing out in these kind of relationships that you're sketching out so beautifully on the ground.
Thanks, Tariq, for your question. This is such an important question. You know, you direct our attention to the various forms that the state takes along borders, starting from the you know, border troops who are federally recruited to the local police, the local politicians, bureaucrats who are from the nerve centers of the state capitals, posted into these remote rural margins, and all the kind of power dynamics that kind of unfold, because these are also sites where there's a range of traffic in commodities, and not just people, but also things like rice, you know, things like cattle, things like export rejected garments. And what I try to show in my work, that it's not just the geographical specificities through which you know, governance occurs in distinct parts of the borderland. And I was just responding to Indiver's question and telling him how the dynamics differ so much in Assam as compared to Meghalaya. But what I actually do in my work is to follow the life of these commodities. Now, let me give you just a couple of examples. If you look at rice, you know, rice becomes a very, very controversial commodity in Assam, starting from late 1930s, when you know, Muslim peasants of Bengali origin start arriving in Assam, and there's Indian National Congress and Muslim League, and it's almost in 1947 that Romari is actually identified by British intelligence agents as the Pakistan Killa. And people are actually fearing that Assam will be conquered, and you have Maulana Bhashani, you know, who's jailed and comes out, you know, he's a peer, he's a communist, and people actually believe that Assam will be attacked and taken over from India and incorporated into Pakistan. So you have this fantastic case in 1947. As soon as India becomes independent, rice becomes securitized in Assam. So it was not the cow at that moment that became a security issue, it's the rice. In another instance, I followed the long trails of you know, cattle as they move from North and Western India and arrive at the Chor borderlands, which are riverine islands, where despite the fence, which is a static structure, you have an interspersed riverine ecology that still allows the passage of goods. And it is here that the dynamics between armed traders, local police, local bureaucrats constantly play out at the border, in terms of from each focal point that the commodity is moving, the power dynamics. And again, as Willem von Schendel reminds us in his magnificent book, The Bengal Borderland, it's not just the dissident groups that are armed. There are cartels along the borderlands who trade in a range of contraband, who are extremely heavily armed, and there's a constant struggle. Having said all of that, I also want to bring questions of relationality. Now, remember 1947, think about the location in this very sparsely populated hinterland in Meghalaya that borders Bangladesh, where you don't see anyone for miles. And think about the military outpost with just about enough rations, but no chairs, no TVs. I mean, all these equipments to staff military outposts have happened in the last 15 years or so. So military outposts were absolutely situated within a dense civilian landscape where villagers themselves identified with these outposts and supported these outposts, including the border troops, to make favorable impressions with the senior officers, lending crockery, lending chairs. And these were not fleeting transactional instances. These were deeper relationships. And along the Garo borderland, Indian troops have also married Garo women and left, the region. And there's a lot of anxiety and speculation. And you have a similar kind of sense of reciprocity and exchange along the East Pakistan border. And there were also moral panics and anxieties, that Garo women who inherit land will have to give it up to non-Garos in that sense. So that's the short answer, but I try to tease out these complexities in several chapters of the book.
Fascinating, thank you.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I mean, there would be a lot of, I think, follow-up questions on that, but given that we only have a couple of minutes more, I just wanted to ask you quickly about, so there's the anthropology of border and borderlands, right? And a lot of that is focused on the US-Mexican border, and there are obviously, critiques of the way in which that work has been done. I was thinking, given how special and rare the work that you have done in this book is, how would it speak to some of, the concerns brought up within that domain? In other words, what could a study of borders in the global south help us think about borders in general, theoretically? Yeah, if you could just make some points towards that. Yeah.
Thanks, Nafees, so much for flagging the US-Mexico border. Joe Heyman, among others, have written extensively about similar kinds of dynamics along the corridors of US-Mexico. But again, you have to remember that NAFTA and the entire dynamics of free trade associations, the kind of factories that have been set up along Mexico has been, it lends itself to a different logic of economic governance and rule. Having said that, there are also a lot of unanticipated similarities because, I talk about the circulation of Bangladeshi export rejected garments that are produced in Dhaka and around Dhaka's factories, and then that circulate to Bangladesh's borders. And through the journeys of Bangladeshi Christian Garo women traders, they actually, these surpluses, export surpluses make an entry into Northeast India through kinship networks. So there are other ways of thinking about resonances of capital flows. And I get this question often that, why wasn't capital your entry point to understand Northeast India? And I say that, look, capital was my entry point to understand Bangladesh. So let's just reverse our dominant ways of thinking. And I also want to briefly come back and acknowledge, scholars like Willem von Schendel, Jason Kearns, Anu Jale, Shahana Ghosh, who've been co-travelers, and more recently Kasia Pakrovsky, whose book is coming out, and I've really gained a lot from their insights and the work of other scholars who work on Asian borderlands.
Right. Fascinating. I mean, as someone growing up in Meghalaya, I've been a beneficiary of the export surplus that comes into the mainland. So I know exactly what you're saying. It's fascinating. So we've come to the top of the hour. So it's time to wrap up. And thank you once again immensely for your time. It's a really odd time for you. Thank you for doing this. And we look forward to being in touch with you. For our audience, do remember that next week the talk is not on a Thursday; it's on a Wednesday. You can find more information about it on the CASI website. Look forward to seeing you all again. Bye.